if Isaiah 53 is a Glock and Psalm 22 is a rifle, Daniel 9 is a nuclear bomb. I think this is just fantastic. Now, I have a version of this prophecy that's animated and it's 6 minutes and it's on YouTube. So if you want this short and sweet and to the point where it's going to make sense, that's what you should go to. That is not this here tonight. Tonight we're going to get into all the minutia and the detail of this prophecy and do a deep tissue dive into every single objection I've heard about this prophecy over the years from critical theologians, skeptics, atheists, everybody I've ever read on this prophecy, and we're going to look at every single loophole that there could be. Let's get started. Daniel chapter 9, verse 1. In the first year of Darius, the son of Xerxes, that's another name for Xerxes, of Median descent, who was made king over the kingdom of the Chaldeans. This would be around 538 BC, the first year of Darius. In the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, observed in the books the number of the years which was revealed as the word of the Lord to Jeremiah, the prophet, for the completion of the desolations of Jerusalem, namely 70 years. So Daniel, he's an old man at this point. He's got the books open. Well, what's that? What are the books? Well, the books include the prophet Jeremiah. And what's he reading in the books, the Bible? He's saying, I'm reading this part of the book of Jeremiah where it mentions the 70 years. If you don't know this section of Jewish history, the Jews were exiled from their land for things like immorality, idolatry, the worship of false gods, child sacrifice, slavery. And in 2 Chronicles chapter 36 and Leviticus chapter 26, it says that because you didn't follow the Sabbath law, working the land for 6 years and letting it lie fallow for 1, we're going to kick you out of your land for 70 years. So if they were kicked out of their land for 70 years for disobedience, for all those years they didn't let the land get a rest, that means that they must have been doing these sinful deeds for 490 years, according to 2 Chronicles 36. So the land is lying fallow for 70 years while they're kicked out. They're deported from their land by the Babylonians. And this is about 605 BC. When Nebuchadnezzar comes in, there's actually 3 different waves: 605, 597, 587. Let's go with this figure, 605. When the Jews are kicked out of Israel in 605 BC, Jeremiah predicts in Jeremiah 29:10, when 70 years have been completed for Babylon, I will bring you back to this place. Full stop. Daniel is reading Jeremiah. Daniel was one of the deportees, remember, with his 3 friends? And he's doing the math. 605, it's been about 70 years. Now it's 538. We're going to be going home pretty soon. And so he's realizing this is all going to come to a close. God disciplined the nation of Israel for 70 years, but he's going to bring them back. So Daniel gives this heartfelt prayer to God. He says, I gave my attention to the Lord God to seek him by prayer and supplications with fasting, sackcloth, and ashes. And we're going to skip that prayer, though it is beautiful. You're going to have to read that on your own time. But he lays out his heart and the sin of the people. And we did sin against you. And please honor your word to bring us back. And then we pick up in verse 20, while I was speaking and praying and confessing my sin and the sin of my people Israel, then the man Gabriel, now he comes up in chapter 8, is an angel. And for astute Bible readers, you'll know that he comes up at the birth of Jesus in Luke chapter 1, right around verse 32. So Gabriel is here, an angel, making a prediction to Daniel about Jesus, and then he shows up at the birth of Jesus. And Gabriel approaches him. This is the man he had seen previously. He came to him about the time of the evening offering. Gabriel gave me instruction and talked with me and said, O Daniel, I have now come forth to give you insight with understanding. Let me repeat that. I have come forth to give you insight with understanding. What I'm about to give you, in other words, is going to be difficult for you to understand. You need insight and you need understanding. I'm not saying you need some kind of decoder ring or special knowledge, something like that. But what I'm going to say is this is going to be difficult for you to grasp. God doesn't prostitute his truth to anyone who wants it. If you want to get deep into God's truth, a little bit of work is required. And like I said, if you want the short version, you can get a 6-minute version of this. But this is going to be the long version where we're going to go into a kind of a long-form study of Daniel 9. He says, at the beginning of your prayers and supplications, the command was issued, and I have come to tell you, for you are highly esteemed, Daniel. Give heed to the message and gain understanding of this vision. And here's the prediction. 70 weeks have been decreed for your people in your holy city. So right there, who is he speaking about? The Jews. Your people, Daniel is Jewish. Your holy city is the Jewish people, the Jews. To do what? 70 weeks have been decreed. We don't know what that means yet. That's okay. For who or for whom? Your people, your city, the Jews, the city of Jerusalem. To do what? To finish the transgression, to make an end of sin, to make atonement, Kippur, Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, to make Kippur, atonement for sin, iniquity. Those are the 3 words in Hebrew used for sin, transgression, sin, and iniquity. To bring in everlasting righteousness, not just taking you from a negative million up to a 0, but to bring in righteousness, taking you to a positive million, bringing in God's righteousness. To seal up vision and prophecy, something about this prediction is going to bring it all together, and to anoint the most holy place. Now, I'm not precisely sure what each one of those 6 descriptions or descriptors are, but I know who they are descriptive of. This is speaking about Jesus, as the context will make clear. So let's not get into the minutia of what does it mean to bring in everlasting righteousness, and what does it mean to make an end of sin? What is it? We could go in and describe all that, but let's just get the big picture. Whatever's going to happen next is going to bring in atonement for sin. It's going to seal up prophecy. This is, you get the impression Gabriel is really winding up for a big swing here. And he says, you are, again, to know and discern. People say, well, this is real confusing, Daniel 9. Many Bible teachers don't teach Daniel 9 to people in their churches because it's just too confusing. Many apologists or defenders of the faith don't use this because it's too confusing. People wouldn't understand it. Baloney. He says right here, if you know and discern, if you actually think about this and discern this prophecy, if you give heed to the message and insight, you can grasp this. So this is going to take some work, but stick in here. He says you should know and discern that from the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince. So right there, this is not rocket science. We got a time interval. Those are temporal markers. From, until. From what? From the issuing of a decree to rebuild your city, your holy people, your city, Jerusalem. From that decree until Messiah the Prince, Mashiach Najid, King Messiah. How much time is being predicted? Well, he says there will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. 7 and 62 would make 69, but earlier he said 70 weeks. So 70 weeks, now he's saying, well, we're talking about 70 weeks. That's kind of like the thesis statement. Now we're going to narrow down to the first 69 weeks. Now, what's a week and why 69 weeks? We don't know yet. All we know for sure at this point is that he's predicting a period of time from the decree until Messiah. It will be rebuilt again with plaza and moat, even in times of distress. And then after the expiration of the 69 weeks, what happens? After the 69 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off and have nothing. The Messiah, in other words, will die. How's that for a prophecy you'd want to hear from one of your Jewish prophets, the prophet Daniel? Messiah is on his way. Great. When's he going to get here? 62 weeks and 7 weeks. Wonderful. Then what? Then he dies. And he has nothing. Well, it doesn't get worse, does it? Well, then the people of the prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. You're saying it's going to be rebuilt. And we're going to anoint the most holy place, the temple. And now it's been 62 weeks and 7 weeks. And now the Messiah comes and he's killed. And then the temple is destroyed. And the city is burned and looted. What kind of a prophecy is this? This isn't something that you would invent as a Hebrew prophet, is it? This isn't something that you'd want to self-fulfill, is it? Well, then he says, its end will come with a flood. Elsewhere in the book of Daniel, he uses that metaphor of a flood to describe armies coming in to destroy, so not a literal flood. Even to the end, there will be war, desolations are determined. He will make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week. Who is the he? Who is the he? Some people think that the he is the Messiah. But what is the nearest antecedent for the pronoun he? If I said, for example, Jill and Mary went to the store, she needed to buy some tomatoes. To whom is the she referring? Jill or Mary? Well, the nearest antecedent is Mary. Jill picked up Mary at the store. It's referring to Mary. The nearest antecedent for the pronoun he is the people of the prince who is to come, who destroy the city and the temple. So much for the idea that the he here refers to Jesus. Jesus didn't destroy the city and the temple of Jerusalem. This is referring to someone else. In my estimation, this part of the prophecy hasn't been fulfilled yet. And remember we said 62 weeks, 7 weeks, that gets you to 69 weeks. And he will be there for 1 week, 70 weeks. So 70 weeks are declared, 62 plus 7 plus 1 brings you to the 7th week. In my view, this final week isn't until the future. Now, that's a subject that refers to the end of history, the subject of eschatology, the study of the end times. That's not our subject. So if you could just stick with me for the first part of this prophecy, that would be great, because we're not discussing when the tribulation's going to happen, is there going to be a millennium, who is the Antichrist, any of that. We're just sticking with the first part of the prophecy. All right. Let's make this very clear. Let's bring this back down to ground level. What we're seeing here is a timeline from Daniel. First, there's going to be a decree. From the decree to restore and rebuild the city of Jerusalem. Then there's an amount of time that is being predicted. 7 sevens and 62 sevens, or 7 weeks and 62 weeks, until Messiah the Prince will be killed. So, that's the 30,000-foot overview of this prediction. If we were just to stop here, this would be pretty good. What other person in human history claiming to be the Messiah died right before the destruction of the Second Temple in AD 70? Now, there were other messianic claimants that claimed to be Messiah. I'm not asking that. I'm saying, who was the messianic claimant who died, and according to the God of the Bible, was the Messiah, the Prince, was killed right before the expiration date of the Second Temple? This is so intriguing that ancient historians, for example, Suetonius, he wrote at about AD 110. He was a Roman historian. He wrote the lives of the different Caesars. He had this to say regarding this prophecy in Daniel chapter 9. He said, there it spread all over the Orient an old and established belief that it was fated at that time for men coming from Judea to rule the world. We've got a Roman author. Now, we shouldn't expect him to cite Daniel 9, 24 to 27. There weren't even chapter divisions back then. But he's saying Judean men thought that they were going to rule the world. Why? Well, because they had some kind of a prediction, and it even specified the time that this would occur. Did you know that there's no other prophecy in the Hebrew Scriptures that mentions the time of the coming of the Messiah? This is the only one. Suetonius says this predictive prophecy, of course, referred to the Emperor of Rome. He's a good Roman, isn't he? That's a good Roman right there. I couldn't refer to the Messiah. The Messiah, these Jews thought it was their Messiah. It wasn't that. It was referring to the Emperor of Rome. As afterwards appeared from the event, that was real clear in AD 70. There was no Messiah that came to take over the world. The Jewish temple was obliterated. Every stone was left unturned. And Jerusalem was destroyed. There was no Messiah that came before AD 70. That's obvious. And the people of Judea took to themselves. Accordingly, they revolted. The Jewish War, AD 66 to 70. That's Suetonius. Tacitus, regarded as the greatest historian of this time period, writing again about AD 115, he writes this: the majority of the Jews firmly believed that their ancient priestly writings, what would those be? the scriptures, contained the prophecy that this was the very time. Again, where else in the Hebrew scriptures do we have a prediction of the time that men starting from Judea should possess the world? He continues, this mysterious prophecy had in reality pointed to Jesus Christ, Vespasian, and Titus. He's a great Roman. Oh, he must have been hanging out with Suetonius to write that. Vespasian, the general who came in and destroyed Jerusalem and later became emperor. Titus. But the common people, as is the way of human ambition, interpreted these great desires in their own favor and couldn't be turned to the truth even by adversity. Even when they saw the Jewish temple being ripped apart, even when they saw Jerusalem being razed, 1.1 million Jews dead, according to Josephus. Even when they saw that, they couldn't be dissuaded. Vespasian's not the Messiah. Titus is not the Messiah. But the prophecy was supposed to come to fruition somewhere around this time. Now, the timing isn't right. This prophecy, as we'll see, doesn't wind up at AD 70, but it's close. What that shows to us is that they didn't know when this prophecy came to fruition. We didn't get the historical method until the Enlightenment, the Renaissance. They just knew it was close. And they knew sometime around now we're supposed to get the Messiah. One more, Josephus. Now, he's a Pharisee who survived the attack of the Jewish war, and he was a traitor, a Benedict Arnold. He switched over to the Romans. He became a full Roman historian. And so Josephus, writing, knowing who's buttering his bread here, writing in the Jewish wars, he says, what elevated them in undertaking this war was an ambiguous oracle that was also found in their sacred writings, the scriptures. How, at about that time, I know you're getting sick of me emphasizing the word time, but in 3 Roman authors, they're referring to a Jewish scripture that refers to the time of this event. One of their countries should become governor or ruler of the inhabitable earth. Now, this oracle certainly denoted the government of Vespasian. Very good Roman there. Of course, he's pandering to the Romans here. But I hope you don't miss the point. What we're seeing here is that Josephus, Suetonius, and Tacitus knew that the Jews at the time were reading Daniel 9, saying the Messiah is coming, and after the fact, he never came. He never came. He never liberated the world. And consequently, the later rabbis said that the times have passed, we sin too much, and what we need is righteousness and repentance. That's how the Jewish rabbis interpreted Daniel 9. Why didn't he come already? The 3rd and 4th century said we blew it. Messiah never came. Well, if this is all we had, we would have the most influential man in history coming on the scene right before the end of the Jewish era in AD 70. But we can go further. Let's get down into the details. The decree. Which decree in the Hebrew Bible mentions 2 things? First, the rebuilding of the city of Jerusalem. And second, can we date this decree? Which decree mentions the rebuilding of the city of Jerusalem, and can that decree be dated? There are 4 that have been proposed. Ezra 6, 2 Chronicles 36, Isaiah 44 and 45, and Nehemiah chapter 2. 4 have been proposed. Only one of the 4 mentions the city. The other 3 refer to the temple. Isaiah 44 predicts that the city will be rebuilt, but it's not a decree of the city being rebuilt. All it is a prediction of the city being rebuilt. If you wonder whether this is the right decree or not, why is it that, if the other decrees are correct, that when Nehemiah gets to Jerusalem, in Nehemiah 2:13, the city is on fire. The walls are broken down. There is no plaza in moat. Indeed, the story of Nehemiah is the story of rebuilding the city of Jerusalem with your sword in your one hand and your trowel in the other, even in times of distress. Daniel 9:27, plaza and moat, even in times of distress. If these other decrees are right, I've got the question, why is the city lit on fire when Nehemiah gets there? Let's read Nehemiah chapter 2. Nehemiah 2:1, early the following spring, in the month of Nisan, during the 20th year of King Artaxerxes' reign, I was serving the king his wine. I had never before appeared sad in his presence. He was the wine steward, and the wine steward would check the wine to make sure it wasn't poisoned. And so he was sad in the king's presence, and Artaxerxes was probably thinking to himself, "You feeling okay, buddy? Is your tummy hurt? You going to bleed out of your eyes or anything from poison?" So they didn't, that wasn't it. He's emotionally sad. But catch this. The 20th year of Artaxerxes' reign. Artaxerxes is known from history by the king of historians, Herodotus, in Book 7, and the prince of historians, Thucydides, in his Peloponnesian War. Pick up any encyclopedia, or if you're a lazy interpreter, Wikipedia, and you will see very quickly Artaxerxes I is well known. He took over after Xerxes I. Have you ever seen the movie 300? Remember that big, creepy guy who was like 9 foot tall with the bald head, who puts his hands on Leonidas and has all the face chains? That's Xerxes in the movie, the Frank Miller movie 300. This is his son, Artaxerxes. Artaxerxes I takes over after the death of his father in December of 465 BC. This is a firm fact of history. We've got our two best extra-biblical sources, Herodotus and Thucydides, respectively, telling us the date of Artaxerxes' death. So this would mean the 20th year of his reign, 465. If you go 20 years from 465, what would that bring you to? 445. The 20th year of his reign would be 445. Here's a little hiccup, though. In Nehemiah chapter 1, verse 1, he says this, "In the late autumn," fall, let's say September, October, in the late autumn, in the 20th year of Artaxerxes' reign. Nehemiah 2:1 says we've gone from autumn, winter, spring, and now we're in the 21st. No, we're still in the 20th year. There you go, Bible contradiction. There it is. I should call atheist.org and let them know we found one. There it is. Nehemiah, what an idiot. He thought that you could go from autumn over to spring and it's still the 20th year of his reign. What a fool. No, you're the fool, because you're importing January 1st as New Year's Day when Rosh Hashanah for the Jews wasn't in New Year's. It was in the month of Tishri. Tishri comes up outside actually just before this time. And so moving from our calendar, from the autumn, let's say September, October, over into the spring, we're not in the 20th year on our calendar. We're in the 21st year. So if we're to line up what Nehemiah is saying with a secular calendar, we would know this can be dated accurately to 444 BC. So far, this is not controversial. This is not the controversial part of the prophecy. I will tell you when that part comes. I've read about 20 to 25 skeptics on this at this point, or critics. I'll let you know when they say, here's the part. This is the part that's wrong. This isn't it. They agree on this part. Let's keep reading. Do we have a decree? I was terrified, but I replied to the king, "Long live the king. How could I not be sad, though? For the city where my ancestors are buried is in ruins. The gates have been destroyed by fire." There we go. Definitive proof that the decree had not been given yet. Otherwise, the city wouldn't be incinerated. The king asked, "Well, how can I help you, Nehemiah?" With a prayer to the God of heaven, I replied, "If it please the king, and if you are pleased with me, your servant, send me to Judah to rebuild the city where my ancestors are buried." I also said to the king, "If it please the king, let me have letters addressed to the governors of the province. Please give me a letter addressed to Asaph." Now, is this just some kind of a nice, cordial letter like you would write to your grandma? Is that what he's asking for here? This could be either a general letter in Hebrew or a royal letter, just like today. I got a letter from grandma or I got a letter from the president. It depends upon the person who gave you the letter. Here, it's clear that the usage is referring to a legal document from a secular king given to Nehemiah so that he can do what? A decree to rebuild the city. I needed to make beams for the gates of the temple fortress, not the temple. the plaza and moat for the city walls, the plaza and moat, and for a house. I need a house too. Give me a house. And he says in verse 8, and the king granted these requests because the gracious hand of God was on me, 444 BC. So we have our starting point. And then we have a time predicted, 7 sevens and 62 sevens. What is that about? This is where people get weirded out. Is this some kind of numerology where we're trying to get something out of the text that it doesn't really belong? Stick with me here. What is the meaning of the Hebrew word Shabua? Shabua is the Hebrew word for week, or in the plural, that im suffix is to make it plural. So weeks would be shabuim. What does that word mean? If you read your English translations, you'll see weeks, you'll see sevens, and you'll see set of sevens. So that tells you translators, they're not quite sure how to render this. Let's look closely. What is a week? I'd like to give you 4 reasons for thinking that when Daniel is predicting a week, he is referring to a set of 7 years. A set of 7 years. I know for us it's prejudicial when you hear the English word week. You only think of a set of 7 days. For Daniel, this is a set of 7 years. First reason. That word Shabua, week, or Shabuim, weeks, has a semantic range that could allow for a period of time. It's similar to our English word dozen. For instance, if I said to you, I want you to go to the store and pick up a dozen. A dozen what? A dozen eggs? A dozen donuts? A dozen cans of White Claw hard seltzer black cherry flavor? Otherwise known as cough syrup flavor? Is that what you're asking? A dozen what? If you don't give the referent, we don't know what dozen you're speaking about. So you're telling me in English, back in 2022, they had a word, an English word, that meant a set of 12? What, did they use a system that counted by 12s? No. What, did they not use a system that had tens as hundreds, thousands? They did, but they also had a foot long, which was 12 inches, and they had a set of 7, and they even came up with the word dozen, to describe a set of 12. And they used it for all sorts of things. Not just inches, not just time, donuts, beer, eggs, all sorts of different things. We have a word that is, okay? Genesis 29:27. Remember when Laban, the trickster, meets Jacob, the deceiver? Jacob, the deceiver, met his match. And he said, I want your daughter, Rachel. Can I marry her? And Laban says, sure. And last minute, he swaps Rachel with Leah. And I love that line. That's, if you don't think the Bible's funny. The next morning, behold, it was Leah. So he wakes up the next day, goes right to Laban. This is not what I agreed to. I wanted Rachel. And Laban says to Jacob, complete the 7 days of this one. Wait a minute. How long did he work for him? 7 years. Complete the Shabua of this one. And we will give you the other daughter for another 7 years of work. Shabua, in this context, is equivalent to a set of 7 years. Literally in Hebrew, it's 7 years. Whereas in the first case, it's Shabua. Genesis 29:27. There's an example where this word is used that way. Second, how do we know it's being used that way in this context? In Daniel chapter 9? Well, because of the bookends. At the beginning of Daniel 9, it refers to a set of 7 years. At the end of Daniel 9, actually Daniel chapter 10, 2 verses after this prophecy, it switches over from a Shabua of years to a Shabua of days. Let me explain. Daniel knows in 605 there was the exile. There's been 70 years, according to the prophet Jeremiah, chapter 25 and chapter 29. And he's looking back at how the Jewish people were disobedient for 490 years, which resulted in what? A 70-year exile. Then he gets this prophecy in response to that prayer, confessing his sin and the sin of the people, about a set of 70, 7 70s, 490 years in the future, which doesn't refer to punishment, because that's about to be elapsed, but referring to restoration and forgiveness. The context at the beginning of this whole prayer, don't forget, is sets of 70 years. All right? Then, Daniel chapter 10, verse 2. This is 2 verses after our prophecy. Daniel says, I was mourning for 3 weeks of days. 3 weeks of days. Now, why do you feel that, why do you think that he felt the necessity to add 3 Shabuim of days? If Shabua necessarily refers to Shabua of days, why would you say 3 Shabua, 3 sets of 7 days of days? Clearly in chapter 10, he's saying, I don't want you to think that I was mourning for 21 years. I was mourning for 21 days. So the beginning refers to years. The end, he switches over to days, signaling I'm saying something different than what I just was saying earlier. Third reason. The third reason is reason. This description of a decree and getting back into the land and rebuilding the city and having the temple secure and all of this does not fit into a period of 483 days. That is nonsense. No one believes that. Well, what did Jesus say to the Pharisees and the religious leaders? He said, I'll destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. And they said, it took 46 years to rebuild this temple. You're going to raise it up in 3 days? To rebuild the city of Jerusalem in a year and a half is nothing short of absurd. He's saying this is going to be a long period from the decree until the city is rebuilt. Fourth, there are parallel examples of what I'm speaking about. The Hebrew word azor, literally means a set of 10. Now, to be fair, in 13 out of the 16 usages of this word azor, it always refers to a set of 10 days. Remember Ron Burgundy? 50% of the time it works 100% of the time, right? Same thing here. 13 out of 16 times, it always refers to 10 days. Whenever azor is used, it's always 10 days, except for 3 times. In the Psalms, it's used to refer to a 10-stringed instrument. It's the same word. There's no modifier. It doesn't tell you 10 days, azor days, or azor strings. It just tells you azor, an instrument with azor. An instrument with 10 days? No, an instrument with 10 strings. The same thing is happening here. Only, this is much easier for us is Shabua, because we're referring to periods of time, not moving from time to musical instruments, or a set of concrete things, like strings. Well, the Greeks, according to Chris Sandoval, he's a skeptic, he said, quote, spoke of hebdomads, or periods of 7 years, much as we speak of a decade. This wasn't unusual. Now, of course, the Greeks came after the time of Daniel. I'm just saying that there was historical, cultural precedent to speak of a set of 7 years at this time. So, semantic range, the word could be used for years. The context refers to years. This doesn't make sense if it refers to days. And there's other examples in the Hebrew language. Both Christians and critics agree on this point. I can't stress that enough. I'm saying skeptics of the Bible. I'm saying critical theologians. Across the board, I could not find someone interpreting this prophecy saying that this referred to a set of 7 days. This is not the part that people argue about. I misspoke. I found one example where instead of weeks referring to years, it refers to days. It comes from Jason Long's book, Biblical Nonsense. I quoted him last week. He's a PhD in pharmaceuticals, so he's an expert on the Hebrew language. He writes this, he says, the Hebrew word for week, septad, actually means sevens, but the Israelites commonly use the term to refer to a set of 7 days. In order for the upcoming prophecy to fit, disingenuous apologists like James Rochford must alter the obvious meaning of septad to 7 years in quintessential post hoc fashion. So watch out for these people defending the Bible and saying this refers to Jesus, because, and this is pretty brazen, pretty bold, isn't it? Just like these people like to try and change what the Hebrew word meant in a post hoc fashion. He's pulling out the Latin on us too. Wow. And you read these guys, or you watch these guys on YouTube, and they come in so strong, so confident. Guess what? That's not the Hebrew word. Septad isn't even, that's like a Latin word maybe. That's not, I couldn't even find the definition of that word. You Google that word, you know what pops up? Heptad. It's not a Hebrew word at all. And yet here we have Jason Long has saved us once again from biblical nonsense. Read a book. That's not the word. All right. All the early church fathers, look at that. All the early church fathers, along with the Jewish scholars, so Christians or Jews, interpreted each week as referring to a period of 7 years, and they applied this quite literally. So whether you're Jewish or Christian, and then today, critics or Christians, they all agree, except for one guy who I could find. And I'm telling you, I really had to dig deep to find that. Well, that part people agree on. So if we were to put this together, 7 sets of 7 years would be 49 years. 62 sets of 7 years would be 434 years. So 49 plus 434 would be 483 years. Nice. So we got our starting point, 444 BC. Then we just have to count forward on the calendar, and then we would have the timing of the death of the Messiah. That's not that hard, right? Now at this point, people pause and they say, 7 sets of 7 and 62 sets of, what is all this? Why doesn't he just say 69 sets of 7? Or better yet, 483 years. Why doesn't he just say that? Huh? Why doesn't he say that? Answer, I don't know. I didn't live 2,500 years ago in a different culture, in a different place. Let me ask you an equal question. Aristotle said that women should marry when they are 18 years of age and men at 7 and 30. Aristotle, what an idiot. Why didn't he say 37? In the Greek, in the original Greek, I had to look this up, talk about nerding out. You read the more modern versions of Aristotle, his Politics, they'll just fix it. It says 18 years of age and men at 37. If you go to the Greek, hepta, 7, kai, and triakonta, 30. He literally said 7 and 30. Aristotle, why did you do that in the 4th century BC? I don't know. I don't know why he did that. What about Gellius? He says 8 and 20 days. 8 and 20 days. Why did he say that? Why not just 28 days? I don't know. I don't know why he said that. Then again, why didn't Abe Lincoln say 87 years ago, our fathers landed upon this continent a new nation at the Gettysburg Address? Why did Abe Lincoln say 4 sets of 20 and 7 years ago? Why not 87? I don't know. But 150 years ago, apparently that was the hip thing to say at a speech. Some people think that these 7 and 7 years, those 49 years, refer to the rebuilding of Jerusalem after the decree. That would fit right in line with Nehemiah. I'm not sure. I really don't know. But that seems to fit. The rebuilding would be from 444 to some period, 49 years after that, rebuilding of the city of Jerusalem under Nehemiah's reign. And then you have Ezra, not the political ruler, but the spiritual ruler, helping to rebuild the temple at the same time. That seems plausible to me. Again, I'm not sure. I don't know. I'm just saying it's plausible, and this is what we're reading. We can't arrogantly import our 21st century sensibilities on an ancient text. That's what I would say. So, 444 BC, if we had a calculator, 444 minus, I know we're moving forward just to make it easy, minus 483, that would bring you to AD 39 for the death of Jesus. Pretty close. That is pretty close. Now, Jesus died in AD 33. I'd like to see you get that close, though, to predict the death of the world's, human history's, most influential man within 6 years. That is pretty freaking close. How could you do that? Okay, but we forgot something. Just like you got all screwed up over the 7 sets, and we shouldn't import our modern views on an ancient text. The same thing is true here. The ancient Jews did not use our calendar system. The Gregorian calendar didn't come to when? 15th, 16th century? The lunar year has been used throughout history. The question is, what did the ancient Jews use when doing prophecy? Number one, religiously, and you get this from one end of your Hebrew scriptures to the other, they oriented their their religious calendar around the new moon calendar. Now, a lunar year alternates between 29 days and 30 days. 29 and 30, 29 and 30. So a lunar year, seeing a new moon, would be 354 days. However, this was rounded to the nearest number, 30, as I'm going to demonstrate. But during this time, the Jews would use a lunar year. Let me give you this. 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 38. This is at the building of the temple in 1 Kings 6 with Solomon. In the 11th year, in the month Yerah of Bull, which is the 8th month Hodesh. Wait a minute. Why did he just switch the Hebrew? Well, you might not know the Hebrew, right? But why did he switch from month and month from Yerah to Hodesh? Yerah is the Hebrew word for month. Guess what Hodesh is the Hebrew word for? Begins with an M and ends with an un. Don't patronize me. Moon, that's what it is. Month is equivalent to a moon. Okay, and we see this throughout the Hebrew Bible. When you have to mourn a person, how long do you mourn? For 30 days, for a full moon. It starts at the first day of the new moon, and so on and so forth. Sir Colin J. Humphreys out of Oxford, he says there are at least 4 different Dead Sea Scroll texts from the Qumran caves that refer in detail to a lunar calendar. Okay, so historically, when we read our Old Testament, we see that the months consisted of 30 days. So we read during the time of the flood, Genesis chapter 8, verse 3, after 150 days, exactly 5 months from the time that the flood began. How many days were in a month according to Genesis 8? 30. 30 times 5 is 150. So religiously, they centered it around the new moon. Historically, there's precedent for a month being 30 days. Prophetically, when they were predicting the future, this is where it's most important. John the Apostle, predicting about a time at the end of history in the book of Revelation, he equates 42 months with 1,260 days, or time times and half a time. Time is 1 year, times is 2 years, and half a time is half a year. 3 different ways, in other words. 42 months, 3.5 years. 1,260 days, 3.5 years. Time times and half a time, 3.5 years. And look, multiple references. 2 references for 42 months. 2 references for 1,260 days. I've read the other interpreters on this, and they say, well, yeah, he's just rounding. He's just rounding to a near number. Give me a break. You rounded to 1,260 days. You don't round to that. You round to 1,000, like we read in Revelation 20. There's going to be a millennium, a 1,000-year reign. He says that 6 times in Revelation 20. This is different. You don't round to 42 months. Time times and a half. That's not rounding. That's very specific. If that's rounding, I will stop there. All right. Culturally, the surrounding nations utilized a 360-day calendar year. Oh, and just so I close the loop on that. If John was saying 42 months is 1,260 days, that is 30 days per month. Okay. Culturally, the Egyptians, according to Herodotus, basing the calendar on 12 30-day months, intercalculate 5 additional days every year, whereby the cycle of the seasons returns with uniformity. So in order that eventually, after so many years of doing this, we have a leap year. You add February 29th every 4 years, you get that 365 and a quarter. That way winter doesn't become summer after so many years. They would do a 360-day year and then add 5 days at the end. But here's the kicker. The Egyptians had 2 parallel calendars. One for civic society, and one for religious society. Humphreys says this goes back as early as 3000 BC, all the way up to and including the time of Daniel, to 180. And these 2 calendars went side by side. Guess which one was the religious calendar? 360. The Egyptians used a 360-day calendar. The Romans, according to Plutarch, he says this, during the reign of Romulus, that's going back way far, 8th century BC, they had been irrational and irregular in their fixing of the months, so he's critiquing this, But, he says, during Romulus's reign, they calculated the year that should consist of 360 days. What about the Babylonians? This is the clearest cut case that we have. I'll show you here in a second. Babylonians used a 360-day year. Let me ask a biblical question, trivia question. In what culture was Daniel raised and educated as a young man? Babylon. Now, was he in Babylon at this point? No, the Persians had taken over. But he learned all of the language and the history and the art and understood Babylonian culture, and the Babylonians used a 360-day year. I came across this recent article. This is from a Jewish author, I'm assuming. He's out of Hebrew University. His name is Jonathan ben Dov, son of Dov. So I'm assuming this is a Jewish author, not a Christian, certainly not trying to prove or help the case of Daniel 9. Okay? And he doesn't cite Daniel 9 in this article. This is from Harvard Theological Review. This is not from Bob Jones University, right? Nothing, well, I do have something against Bob Jones. It's a little bit fundamentalist for my taste. But I'm saying here, this is a non-Christian, scholarly, academic, not trying to support the Bible. Are we on the same page? He writes this: administrators in ancient Judah used schematic 30-day months and a 360-day year alongside other annual frameworks. So they could add the lunar year, adding in another month every 4 years, every 3 years. But alongside that, he's arguing they had a 360-day calendar. Long-term calculations, like 483 years long-term, are nearly impossible. A schematic calendar, in contrast, avoids these problems by employing a fixed number of days or other fixed calendrical structures. When you're predicting way out into the future, what do you need? A fixed set. We can't factor in that extra month every 3 years. In ancient Mesopotamia, under old Babylonians, this would be before the time of Daniel, the most widespread system in administrative use was a schematic year of 360 days, which existed alongside the lunar calendar. So we find, for example, the Babylonian tablet. I almost said the Babylonian Talmud. That's not what we're talking about. The Babylonian tablet dates to 2000 BC. There we read of a receipt given to some laborers, 36 female laborers. From this month to that month, their labor is 12,960 days. That's how much we're going to have to pay them in the future. You say, so what? 36 workers, 360 days a year, brings you to 12,960. A 360-day year when you're predicting in the future. So too, we see in the Babylonian Diviner's Manual, this would be closer to the time of Daniel, we read 12 months per year, 360 its days. But it gets even better. Ben Dov writes, the Mesopotamian schematic year serves as an analogy to a similar, yet not identical tradition, which arose in the early first millennium BCE among Judahite Israelite administrators. He goes into the descriptions how they excavated Israel, and they found these small bone plaques, calendars, that actually show this. The find includes 9 plaques. They go all the way back to Iron Age 2. That's the time of David to the exile. This is before the time of Daniel. 9 plaques alongside other less prominent places. The holes drilled in these rectangular plaques are arranged in 3 lines of 10 holes each, altogether 30 holes. The plaque was used by means of inserting a peg into the hole and advancing them along the days of the month of the year. You have a calendar at home? You ever have a really big vacation or anniversary, something you're looking forward to, and you go through and with a magic marker? That's what they would do. They have these plaques and they put the peg in. All right, day 1, day 2, day 3. We have these plaques. Check this out. 10 by 3. 30-day months. Then the other ones we found were these, 15. Half of the month. Basically, if you're trying not to think of the entire month, maybe your peg would get unlodged. They had bone plaques that they found, which were 15 days Of course, 15 and 15. It's not 7 and 7, that's for sure, or 14 and 14. 15 days. We have the material evidence right there. Let me remind you also, this is from 2021. As in other cultures of the ancient Near East, Judah of the Iron Age had also known a schematic year as part of its administrative heritage. This year did not constitute a calendar in the narrow sense, because no civil or religious activities were dated on its basis. Rather, it was an administrative framework used by clerks and administrators for long-term calculations. They're saying they had two calendars, the lunar, 354, where you would insert an extra month every 3 years as your leap month, alongside a schematic calendar for long-term predictions. As my father would say, bada boom, bada bing. There it is. Now let me tell you, this is the part of the prophecy that the skeptics are all over. And then in 2021, we found material evidence that when they predict the future, they use 30-day months, 360-day years. What does this bring us to? If we switch over from our preconceived understanding of a lunar calendar over into the Jewish, how did Ben Dove put it? The schematic year, the prophetic year, in the words of Dr. Harold Honer, whatever you want to call it, they had a calendar working alongside the lunar calendar. If we switch over that onto our modern calendar, this isn't hard. This is like switching from metric to the English system or vice versa. There's no sleight of hand. It's just what is a kilometer in comparison to a mile? And we're putting their calendar onto our Gregorian calendar. How would we do that? Not hard. With a calculator, you would just get 483 years. And how many days were being predicted in their years? 360 days per year. So 483 times 360 days per year would get you to a number of days, which is 173,880. 173,880 days. But in order to transfer and translate that onto a 365-day calendar, you have to divide by 365. Are you with me? 173,880 days is being predicted, divided by 365 days to a year, and that gets you 476 years. 476.3, I believe. 476 years. So instead of 483, we've got the wrong calendar. Again, when we look at the Jewish people, we would never import our scientific knowledge onto their text or our medical knowledge onto their text, but we would import our chronological knowledge onto their text. That is so self-centered of us to do that. This is an ancient text. Use their calendar. Don't use your own. When we translate it, it's 476 years. And so then, starting point, 444 BC, 476 years, brings you to AD 32. Real close. I'm talking very close. 5 centuries in advance, predicting the date of the most influential man in human history to within a year. Within a year. That's pretty close. But we forgot one more part, and this part is not controversial. There is no 0 year. When you go from BC to AD, there is no 0. Nothing happened August 13th, 0 AD, or should I say 0 BC? No, 0 is the marker in between the years. But it itself is not a year. Let me give you a parallel. There is no 0 century. There's a 1st century BC and a 1st century AD. But there is no 0 century that is in between the 2 centuries. There is no 0 year in between 1 BC and AD 1. That's just a marker, 0, in between the two. So let's do a little exercise together. Let's say I'm living in 3 BC, and I'm trying to figure out what year we should plan my 5-year anniversary, right? Because I'm a very loving, Roman man, and I love my sweetie pie, and I want to plan my 5-year anniversary. And so I say, honey bunny, we should go to Greece or whatever, and we should do that in 5 years. And she says, okay, what year will that be? Well, honey, it's 3 BC, 3 years before Christ. And in 5 years, that'll be, let's see, 3 minus 5, that'll be AD 2. So AD 2, we're going to go out on our anniversary, April 3rd. It's going to be great. And she says, honey, you dunce, there is no 0 year. I say, what do you mean? He says, count with me. 3 BC, 2 BC, 1 BC, AD 1, AD 2, AD 3. We have to add a year because we're crossing from BC to AD. The same is true here. There is no 0 year. There is no 0 century. If we move from BC to AD 32, add that 0 year, we get AD 33, the preferred date for the death of Jesus of Nazareth. So we have that, the fulfillment, Messiah the Prince. Now at this point, people say, we got really close there, didn't we? You almost got me. But Messiah the Prince could be Onias III. Messiah is used something like 40 times in the Old Testament. It's referred to David, and priests are Mashiach. They're anointed of the Lord. And even Cyrus is called the Mashiach of the Lord. How do we know this is like the Messiah, like King Messiah? I'll tell you how. The Septuagint, the Jewish translation of the Hebrew Bible, translated by Jewish people before the time of Jesus, translated this as the Messiah, to Christou, the Messiah. The Stone edition, a Jewish translation of the Hebrew Bible, translates this as the Anointed One, not just an Anointed One. And the JPS, the Jewish Publication Society, translates this as the Messiah, the Prince. The Hebrew here is Mashiach, but not just Mashiach, Anointed One. Many could be anointed ones. Priests, prophets, kings, even Cyrus. Mashiach Najid. Messiah, the Prince. And if you say Prince, that's one thing. And if you say Mashiach, Messiah, that's another. But if you put Mashiach Najid together, that is saying King Messiah. Guess who else is called Mashiach Najid the most in the Old Testament? David. And David is the archetype, the prototype for King Messiah. This is predicting the Messiah. This is not predicting just some anointed person. And after this event takes place, we have a gap of time. Remember I said to other people, they say that, the idea that final week of Daniel's prophecy, the 70th week, that would still be in the future. They really balk at that, and they drives them nuts. It drives them crazy. They say, because I can't believe there would be a gap of time between 70 or AD 33 and all the way 2,000 years later to the end of history. Those people also believe in a gap. They believe in a gap between the death of Messiah and the destruction of the temple. Their response to my response? Well, it's only 40 years. A gap is a gap. A gap is a gap. Once you allow that there's a gap, what makes you have the right to say, well, a gap can be 40 years, but it can't be 100 years. A gap could be 100 years, but it can't be 500 years. That's outrageous. A gap can be 500 years, but it can't be 2,000 years. Listen, Jesus is the one who taught gap prophecy. Luke chapter 4, right around verse 21, he reads Isaiah 61. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, and I've come to bring in a rescue for the slaves. And then he pauses in the middle of a Hebrew couplet. It'd be like roses are red, violets are blue. No, roses are red, violets are... He pauses in the middle of a Hebrew couplet. And the rest of it says, and bring in the vengeance of the day of the Lord. Jesus saw a break of 2,000 years between Isaiah 61 verse 2a and Isaiah 61 verse 2b. Jesus had this idea. Okay, I'm going off on a tirade there. But anyways, there's a gap in between the death of Messiah, and it never says that it happens sequentially right after. It just says after this, then the prince who is to come will destroy the city of Jerusalem and the temple. This did happen in 70 AD. Josephus says that 1.1 million Jews were killed. All right, let's think it through some common questions, and then we'll wrap up and take some questions together. Was this prediction from Daniel chapter 9 written after the New Testament was written? Was this a later interpolation where they squeezed this into Daniel 9? Now, there's a lot of debate over when Daniel was written. Did the true Daniel write under the reign of the Persians in 530 BC, or did he write in 167 BC? There's a debate. Was it in the Persian era, or was it in the Maccabean era? Incidentally, it's very hard for critics to believe that Daniel wrote in 530 BC because he predicts the sequence of major world empires and describes Alexander the Great's reign in Daniel chapter 11 with no less than 130 specific predictions. Daniel 11 has the most predictions of any chapter in the Bible, bar none. So to a critic, there's no such thing as supernatural prophecy. Daniel must have written 167 BC during the Maccabean era. We're going to come back to that in later weeks. But right there, I'd like to point out something. Whether Daniel was writing 530 BC or whether he was writing 167 BC, is it any easier to predict the exact date of the death of the most influential person in history 600 years in advance or 200 years in advance? As I said before, this would be the same as George Washington predicting the next president of the United States or Abraham Lincoln predicting the next president of the United States. They're both qualitatively, maybe not quantitatively, there's different amounts of years in between, but qualitatively, it would be equally impossible. All right, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, we have 8 manuscripts of Daniel that date to right around 100 BC. These are not complete manuscripts. They don't have this section of Daniel 9. It's not that it's been excised. It's not that it goes from Daniel 8 to Daniel 10. It's just these are fragmentary. So the manuscripts that we do have date to 100 BC. Vanderkam and Flint, who are experts in this whole literature, they say the manuscripts we have match perfectly what we have in the Masoretic text. So they say, based on this, we've got copies of Daniel for all intents and purposes. This is solid evidence that Daniel was written at least by 100 BC. We have the manuscripts. But we have Daniel 9 in the Testament of Levi, dated to 146 BC, the actual prophecy, and we have an interpretation of the prophecy in what's called the Melchizedek fragment, which dates to 50 BC. There we read, the messenger is the anointed of the Spirit about whom Daniel spoke. Who is the Mashiach about whom Daniel spoke? Daniel chapter 9. This is a citation or an allusion to Daniel 9:25. So I'm not saying Daniel was written in 167. I'm not saying he was written in 100 BC. I'm going to argue for a 6th century BC date of Daniel, which I believe is very warranted, very defensible. I'm just saying let's give the critics what they want and say 167. That's still predicting Jesus 200 years in advance. So if we go into the ring with both hands tied behind our back, we still win. How do we know Jesus died in AD 33? Isn't there some division among New Testament historians and scholars as to whether he died in 30 AD rather than 33? Well, for one, I want to point this out. We don't have a date for the death of Jesus. It's not that we read in the New Testament documents, and then he died on a specific day in April, AD 33. We don't have that. What we have instead are a bunch of historical data, and from all these data points, we inductively try and put together, when did Jesus die? We do this with all of history. So when we put together all of the data demonstrate to the best process that Jesus died in AD 33. I'm going to try and walk you through this. He either died in AD 30 or 33. That's the big debate in scholarship today. How do we know that? Here's how. Okay. Tacitus, book 15, chapter 44. He says that Jesus, the so-called Christ, the Christians named after Christus, their Messiah, they were killed and so forth. So he mentions Christus, Christ, the Latin rendering of Christ. And he mentions Christians, followers of Christ, who were being burned alive by Nero. Then he says, non-believing historian, this was during the reign of whom? Caiaphas, the high priest, who dates from AD 18 to 37. and Pontius Pilate, who was the governor or prefect, from AD 26 to 36. So that narrows down the time that Jesus could have died. He suffered the extreme penalty, and it was during Caiaphas and Pontius Pilate's reign. So that narrows our window to a decade. Are you with me? So 26 to 36. Extra biblical source. Jesus died on a Friday. We get that from John 19:31, the day of preparation, Mark 15:42, the day before the Sabbath. The Sabbath, of course, is not a Sunday. That's a Christian idea. The Sabbath was a Saturday. So the day before is a Friday. He died on a Friday. Passover was on Nisan 14. And when you line up Nisan 14 with a Friday, a date, if I said April 3rd with a Friday, it's got to land on a Friday though. Nisan 14 on a Friday, that gives you only 27, 80, 30, 80, 33, 80, 36. So we're down to a decade when Jesus could have died. And then when we look into the New Testament documents, it says, well, he died on a Friday. Well, that means it's either 27, 30, 33, or 36. But we can get closer. It's in the 15th year of Tiberius that Jesus begins his ministry. How do you know that? Well, Luke chapter 3. Now, I'm just citing that as a secular source. I'm not saying it's inspired. I'm just saying in Luke 3, Luke records that Jesus started his ministry in the 15th year of Emperor Tiberius. When did Tiberius take the throne? September 17th, AD 14. So the 15th year would take you up, well, let's not get too confusing here. That takes you up past 27. So 27's out. 27 cannot be the date. Because 15th year from 14, that takes you up to 28, 29, let's say. So 27's out. 36 is out. If he starts his ministry sometime in, 28, 29 AD, he had an 8-year ministry. Nobody believes that. Nobody believes Jesus had an 8-year-long ministry or 7-year-long ministry or 9-year. Nobody believes it was that long. So 27's out. 36 is out. That leaves you with 30 or 33 is the only two dates that are remaining. And this, as I said, is the debate. And here's why. I just explained why. Okay? Bart Ehrman, he says, Jesus, quote, almost certainly died from the 30s of the Common Era. Almost certainly died. But that doesn't tell us when. He believes AD 30. I'm arguing for AD 33. New Testament scholarship is split 50-50. Some say 30, some say 33. I'm going to argue 33. Here's why. John records at least 3 Passovers. At least 3 Passovers. John 2, John 6, John 11, and 12. If Jesus started his ministry in AD, let's try and help the AD 30 people out as much as we can. If he started his ministry in AD 28, it really would have been AD 29. Let's say AD 28, and there's 3 Passovers. That takes you past AD 30 into AD 31. Now, why wouldn't New Testament historians and scholars like this very much? Because they don't think the Gospel of John is historically reliable. That's why. To me, this is a throwaway detail. John is writing about it, and the Passover was coming up. And the Passover, one of the times, it's when he's feeding the 5,000, and the Passover was near. He's not trying to allude to anything here that was not historical. So, if there's 3 Passovers, that's a lock right there. It's AD 33, end of story. But there's more. This figure from history named Lucius Sejanus. Lucius Sejanus. Bear with me here. The payoff is big. Ready? Lucius Sejanus. He was the most powerful man in the Roman Empire. He was the right-hand man of Emperor Tiberius around the AD 20s, AD 30s, early AD 30s. He was, for all intents and purposes, running the Roman Empire. Emperor Tiberius was an incredible hedonist, much like the other emperors, right? He's out on the island of Capri, and I don't want to talk about all the debauched things he's getting into, but sex, drugs, rock and roll, everything else, out on the island of Capri, and he's just basically getting, obliterated out of his mind, orgies, everything under the sun. And he's saying, Sejanus, you run the empire. Here's the problem for the Jews. Sejanus is a terrible anti-Semite. He hates Jews. he appoints one of his buddies, this guy you probably never heard of, Pontius Pilate, is to be governor over. And guess what Pontius Pilate was? He was an anti-Semite. He hates the Jews. So you got Sejanus basically running the empire, Pontius Pilate running Israel. So if the Israelites, the Jews, if they had a problem with how they're being treated by the Romans, who would they go in HR to talk to? Pilate. And Pilate's going to give them the one-finger salute and say, I don't care what you think. I mean, Pilate he brought in shield standards with idols into the temple. He had the Jews beaten with underground men with clubs. I mean, he was vicious to the Jews. But here's what happens. If the complaint got from the Jews to Pilate, and let's say Pilate is having an extremely heartfelt day, and he reports it to Sejanus, Sejanus is going to say, I hate the Jews too. I don't care about the Jews. And he's definitely not going to send the report to Tiberius because he's on the island of Capri having sex and doing as much as he can. So that's the narrative. Now, Sejanus gets delusions of grandeur. In AD 31, let me repeat that. AD 31, Sejanus gets delusions of grandeur. And he says, we're going to lead a coup d'etat. We're going to kill and assassinate Tiberius and his kids. And I've been running this empire anyway, so I'm going to take the throne. Tiberius wakes up out of his drunken sex slumber, realizes what's happening, calls in Sejanus as though he's going to talk to him, surrounds him, has him executed right there on the spot in AD 31. What does this all have to do with the dating of Jesus' death? This explains why Pontius Pilate is so passive to the Jewish leadership in the Gospels. For so long, scholars have wondered, Pilate hates the Jews. Pilate is a tough, fierce, brutal man. And yet when the Jews boss him around, he's like, okay, I don't want to have this guy crucified. You better do it. All right, I guess I'll do it. Whatever you say. That's not Pilate. Pilate hates the Jews. In fact, we read in John 19:12, Pilate tried to release Jesus, but the Jewish leaders shouted, if you release that man, you're no friend of Caesar. Anyone who declares himself a king is a rebel against Caesar. Okay, here's the kicker. When Tiberius, the emperor, had Sejanus killed, he started wondering if my right-hand man was leading a coup to have me killed and assassinated, who else out there is trying to have me killed? And so he started to look at all of Sejanus' friends, family, and appointees. Who appointed Pilate? Lucius Sejanus. And so Pilate was under the microscope by Tiberius. His buddy, the right-hand man, was just killed. He got his appointment from Sejanus. He's friends with Sejanus. And now Tiberius has got the microscope on Pilate. And if he makes one false move, he's going to be in big trouble. Now the Jewish leadership is saying, if you allow this man who claims that he's a king, remember Luke 23:4, are you a king? You say so, yeah. You're admitting to be a king? You say, you're allowing a king to rise up in Israel? You're no friend of Caesar, and you're a rebel against Caesar. We're going to tattle. And this time, you can't stop us, because it's going to make it to Capri. It's going to make it to Tiberius. So what does Pilate do? He bends over backwards. And the question is, why? Why would he do this? It's in Luke 23. It's in John 19. Why is he so passive when it comes to the Jewish leadership? I'll tell you what. That would make no sense on an AD 30 reading. Because Sejanus would still be in power. There'd be a barricade between Tiberius, and he'd be under no suspicions, no life-threatening, nothing. But if Jesus died in AD 33, Pilate would be sweating with fear, worried that Tiberius was going to come for him, and that the Jews were going to tell on him and have him killed. He's a Sejanus ally. He's a Sejanus lover. That leaves us with the date, April 3rd, AD 33, 4333, for Jesus' death. We can get it down to the exact date. Like I said, another reason that people prefer the 30 dating is because the book of Acts is kind of cramped if you go with the 33 dating. Not that much. If you do the study on the chronology of Acts, There's room. There's plenty of room. But mostly they don't consider John to be a historical, authoritative source of history, where I just reject that presupposition. I think John is a very good historian. All right, how do we know he died in AD 33? We got that. What if Jesus or the disciples self-fulfilled these predictions? You're going to get sick of hearing me say it. This will be the last time, I promise. This is a huge admission. You just said that's not really the Messiah, it's just a Messiah. You just said it doesn't actually bring us to the right date. You just said that it's not the right decree. All that goes right out the window if you hold this view. That he or they self-fulfilled this prediction. I'll go even further on that. How come the church fathers couldn't figure it out? How come the disciples never cite Daniel 9:24-26 in the New Testament? If you just self-fulfilled the greatest prophecy known to man, wouldn't you be screaming it from the rooftops? Like they cite Isaiah 53 40 times. They cite Psalm 22 25 times. They cite Daniel 9:24-26 0 times. They cite Daniel 9:27. It was there. I mean, it was in the canon. They didn't cite this. Now, critics say that's because they didn't believe it was fulfilled in Jesus. Wrong. They didn't cite it because they didn't think it had any apologetic value. Nobody could do the math. So they knew it was getting close. I mean, ask Suetonius, ask Tacitus, ask Josephus. They're like, we know it's soon, but we think it's Vespasian. We think it's Titus. They knew now's the time, but they couldn't get it to the year. So the New Testament authors don't cite it because they didn't know. All right. Crucifixion was not in Jesus' self-interest. Why would you want to be the Messiah that gets cut off? Why not be the Messiah of Daniel 7, who comes to rule and reign over the entire world? No one expected a crucified Messiah before Jesus lived, so even if you're trying to get something going, this would not be the way to do it. You don't fulfill passages about how you die. You fulfill passages about how you make other people die if you want to be the Messiah. Jesus' closest disciples paid the ultimate price for this if they were lying, which is something that even critics concede. And as I said, the New Testament authors don't give a date, nor do they cite this passage. So to self-fulfill it, they would need to say, and by the way, it was April 3rd, AD 33, and we're fulfilling this. That's not in the New Testament. And they don't even cite the passage, not because they don't know Daniel 9. They cite Daniel 9:27. They don't cite it because this wouldn't have had evidential value for their time and day. All right, let's wrap up. Daniel claimed the Messiah would arrive before the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in AD 70. That right there, I think, is pretty good. To be able to predict the world's most influential man and say it's going to happen before that event, and Jesus comes in right under the wire 40 years before he dies, Israel's dispersed, and the world is changed forever. But more than that, Daniel predicts the exact year of his death. Guys, we don't have anything like this outside of the Bible. This is unique to biblical prophecy. Week number 5, we're going to go through, we're going to study all the other alleged prophecies out there. Nothing like this. You know, if you had somebody in the stock market predicting stocks this well, you'd say that's insider trading. We know better. You don't just accidentally predict it that well. Yet here we've got something incommensurably more difficult than predicting the stocks, hundreds of years at least in advance. And as I said, the world's most influential person. In 2013, Cambridge University Press published this book here, Who's Bigger? And they ranked who is the most influential person in human history. And there have been lots of lists like this, but this list was unique because they didn't just go with people's opinion. They didn't go with a lot of different criteria. What they did is they put this into an algorithm and put this through to see who actually influenced whom. Guess who came in right at the top of the list in this Cambridge study? Jesus of Nazareth. And here we have one holy book that says this is from God, claims to be inspired by God, and this is what we have in there, pointing directly to the man who changed the world. If you are here tonight and you are still on the fence as to whether or not you want to place your faith and your trust in Jesus Christ, you should do that here with us tonight. You should surrender the pride and say, this is from God. This is from God. There's nothing like this in any other religion. And this is God saying to you right now, I'm real. And if he can predict this, which is something that is falsifiable, something that we can see, that gives us incredible warrant, incredible justification for believing that what Jesus said about the afterlife is true, that we can be forgiven, that we can be loved, and that we can spend an eternity in heaven with God. Only the Bible has this. I want you to remember that. I hope that bothers you. Only the Bible has stuff like this in it. Not just blind belief, but what we have here is absolutely real.